Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Izzy. I'm a Master's Bioresearch student with Sone and Gail Jackson, who some of you may know, at the University of Edinburgh. And my talk's focusing on urban greenspace, but more on the insects and pollinator side, as well as the plants growing in them. So this talk is also contributed to by Patricia Mrazek, who's also a master's student at the University of Edinburgh, and the work was also contributed to by Vladimir Kripsov, who you all heard yesterday. So I'm sure everyone here knows, but just a quick run through of why it's important to study pollinators. So there are many ecosystem services provided by pollinators, one being the pollination of natural flora. So the majority, over 90% of flowering plants are pollinated by insects. And this bleeds into crop pollination. So 75% approximately of global crops are pollinated by insects. And since the 60s, this has increased massively because we've planted even more insect pollinated crops. This bleeds into human health. So these crops are really important for nutritional value, and also human mental health and cultural benefits. So connections with nature can be strengthened through pollinators. They're a really accessible group, especially things like bumblebees and butterflies that people can recognize really easily, and gets people in tune with nature and allows them to understand what's happening and the negative impacts on nature through pollinators. And also that obviously really important in the food webs that they reside in. So this was my attempt to create visually like a nice pollinator habitat. As you can see, there's lots of flowers, there's lots of habitat space. Unfortunately, as a couple of people have mentioned in these last 2 days, a large amount of our natural pollinator ecosystems, so for example species-rich grassland in the UK, has been heavily degraded and lost and fragmented, and this is due to things like agriculture, so the use of land like this being turned into agricultural land and pollution from that, but also urbanisation. We've heard a couple of reasons why urbanisation puts pressures on ecosystems, on natural ecosystems. One being the creation of heat islands. We've also heard about the introduction of non-native species, and also pollution in general. That being said, there are places in the urban environment which can be really great for pollinators and biodiversity hotspots, and these are in our urban green spaces, which we've all been talking about. These include parks, gardens, cemeteries, green roofs, allotments, and that all natural and semi-natural and artificial ecosystems within and around a city or an urban area. In these urban green spaces, there's been a lot of studies showing that increasing floral resources, so basically the number of flowering plants you have, can increase pollinator visitation. And by floral resources, I'm talking specifically about nectar and pollen. This can be done, so the increasing of floral resources can be done many ways. We've just heard about No Mow May quite a lot, and that's a really great scheme, and stuff like that's gained a lot of attention in the last few years in terms of increasing floral resources. Also, the planting of urban meadows has become really popular. This is a sort of diagram from the Wildlife Trust talking about planting your own urban wildflower meadow in your garden, and yeah, it's gained a lot of press attention as well. So there's lots of questions you'd want to be asking if you're thinking about growing an urban meadow, and I'm just gonna run through some of these. So you might want to know whether you should be planting annual meadows. So I know they came up in Bethan's talk. these really showy meadows that people really strongly associate with wildflower meadows, and can be great, but maybe not in terms of the fact that they include non-native species sometimes. But if you plant a native annual meadow, even then it can be quite a lot of work and upkeep. So every year you're going to want to go in, do some more reseeding, which can be costly both in terms of management and in terms of actual money. Or do you want to go for perennial meadows, who might not have that aesthetic value that people associate with urban meadows, but can be a lot less work in terms of upkeep and money. Specifically for pollinators, you're interested in what floral resources are of the plants that you're planting. So how much nectar do your flowers produce and contribute to your urban environment? How much pollen? And leading on from that, how does the choice of seeds that you have impact pollinator visitation? So essentially, what flowers are attracting what insects? And then finally, you'd be interested in the seasonal variation in these floral resources. So does the mix that you choose, or the seeds that you plant, provide pollen and nectar for an entire season? Are there peaks and troughs in this? And where do these occur? So a paper that answered some of these questions is this by Damon Hicks et al. In 2016, and this was about quantifying nectar and pollen resources of urban wildflower meadows. So they planted both annual and perennial meadows, and then used these meadows to quantify floral resources to plant species, and look at how these resources changed over time. And I'm just going to run through really quickly some of the things that they found, because it's interesting. So this diagram here, you can see, this is nectar at the top and this is pollen at the bottom. And this is for annual meadows. So they've just put pictures here of the highest nectar producers that they found in their planted meadows. You've got some calendula, cosmos, and then pollen is calendula and some poppy species as well that were really great for pollen. In terms of perennial species, in terms of nectar, the best were the Echium vulgare, Centaurea nigra, and the Leodonton hispidus. And pollen is, Leucanthemum vulgare, the Centaurea nigra again, and the Malva machata. What is, bit of overlap. Interesting is that they also looked at weed species. So they didn't just investigate the plants that they'd specifically planted, but they also looked at the nectar and pollen contributions of the plants that just popped up. And you can see actually for nectar sugar, many of these weed species were really great nectar producers. And these are things that we see all the time. Taraxacum, 2 species of thistle, and Hypercharis and Senecio as well. So I thought it was really interesting. And then this is just the pollen. So you've got some overlap there. The Taraxacum and the Hypercharis are really great producers of pollen. So as I mentioned, they looked at the importance of the distribution over the year of floral resource production. And I've just highlighted in these green boxes here that for the annual meadows, actually in the early parts of the summer, so in May and June and sometimes even July, there is almost no nectar sugar provision provided by these meadows. And for perennial meadows is a bit better, and there is some nectar sugar being provided, but it's much lower than it is for the rest of the summer. And then this is just for the pollen. So you're seeing similar patterns of start of the summer, almost no pollen resources, and the perennial meadows they do have some, but it's again lower than in the rest of the summer. So oh, it's overlapped again. But what's interesting is that nearly all of the resources in these early months, so in the perennial meadows that we saw, were provided by native perennial weed species. And these are some of the species that I showed in the first few figures that are really great nectar producers, so like the Torexicum, but also things like Trifolium repens and Ranunculus repens as well. So using that information and looking at nectar and pollen resources, I am interested in my master's at looking at managing Edinburgh's urban green space for pollinators. And I'm doing that by looking at the North Edinburgh foreshore, which I'm sure if you're from Edinburgh, you're familiar with, you've probably been to. It's really nice, would recommend. And this is area owned by Edinburgh City Council and managed by the Edinburgh Greenspace team, City Council Greenspace team. You can see here in the orange boxes, these are planted meadows, and these are part of the Wildline project, which is funded by Nature Scott, and look like this. So the photos on the far end are from their first year of flowering. So they were planted with an annual perennial native flower mix, and you can see the annuals very strongly in these first two pictures, and then the perennials. These are from this year, so the summer just gone in those pictures. This is what surrounds the planted meadows mostly, and it's naturalised grassland, so this isn't mowed, it's just left to do its thing. And the majority of this is grasses, as you'd expect, but actually in a couple of the grass patches there are these clumps and communities of flowering plants. So it's quite hard to see. I'll point with this. It's quite hard to see, but these are Veronicas in there. You've also got some orchids that crop up in some of the areas, and ranunculus, and you've got some plantain in there as well. So they do have floral diversity in them, and are therefore interesting for pollinators. So every year since they were planted, so it's 3 summers now, or 3 flowering seasons, these plots and naturalised grassland plots have been looked at in terms of floral diversity and in terms of insect diversity. So there are 8 planted meadows that are 500 metres squared, and these have partner or companion grassland plots. So there are 8 of those as well. It's done through floral surveys, so there's an 80-metre transect, and every 4 metres there's a 1 metre squared quadrat, which is either placed at the edge of the meadow or 1 metre in. And everything flowering in that quadrat is counted, and it's done to the level of the floral unit. So this is anything that a bee-sized insect can walk between. So for some species it's a single flower, and for things with composite heads like Torexicum, it's the whole flower head, not the individual flower. And the insect surveys are done by transect walks. So this is a slow walk along 56-metre transect. Every time a pollinator is spotted on a flower, it's marked, and both the species of plant that it's on and the species or close to species level of the insect is recorded as well. Ooh, they're funky rearrangements. But this data, but specifically from 2021, was used by Patricia Mrzek, who I introduced at the start, who is a master's student currently at the University of Edinburgh, but she did this work for her honours dissertation in 2022. And she was looking specifically at the floral diversity impact on bee species richness and diversity. And she was comparing these planted meadows with these non-mowed naturalised grassland habitats. So she looked first at floral abundance, and as you'd expect, floral abundance was significantly higher in these meadow plots than the naturalised grassland plots, which is nice to see. And flora species richness was also significantly higher in the meadows compared to naturalised grassland plots. And this relates to insects because the apidae abundance, so bee abundance, was higher in the meadows, and species richness of apidae was also higher in the meadows compared to these non-mode plots. So through Patricia's work, we know that floral abundance and species richness differs between these meadow and non-mown habitats. But what was not known, or what hasn't been looked at yet, is how floral resources, so this nectar and pollen, differ between habitat types. She also found out how apidae abundance and species richness differed between meadow and non-mowed habitats. But what's yet to be answered is how insect pollinator abundance as a whole and insect pollinator diversity differs between habitat types. Another habitat along the foreshore is amenity grassland, and this is mowed frequently, it's every 2 weeks, and it's something I'm interested in because, as you can see from some of these photos, they actually have quite a lot of plants growing in them when they're given a chance. So things like the Trexicum, which we've seen before as being a really great producer of nectar. You've also got Plantago and the trifolium repens, which is really, really popular with a lot of insect pollinators. I'm interested in this amenity grassland because actually a massive percentage of urban green space worldwide is lawns and amenity grassland type habitats. And they do have potential for supporting pollinators, but it all depends on their management. So studies in both Sheffield and Paris on lawns showed that you can find a wide variety of plant species in lawns, and the majority of these are native species. So for my master's and for my project, there are a couple of key research questions or aims that I want to answer. And first is how floral resources, so this nectar and pollen, change over time within each habitat type. So that's the planted meadows, the non-mowed meadows, and also this frequently mowed habitat type rather than meadow. I'm specifically interested in whether there are gaps in floral resources in any of these habitat types, and whether the other habitat types fill in these gaps. So is a combination of habitats actually more beneficial than just having one blanket management regime? Obviously interested in pollinator visitation. So how does pollinator visitation change over a flowering season within each habitat type? Is one habitat type best for a particular pollinator group? And using this information, I want to create a plant pollinator network of the foreshore. So I want to know which insects are visiting which plants across all the habitat types, and then testing the robustness of this foreshore network to the extinction of specific plant and insect species. So using the floral surveys and the insect surveys that have been done over the last couple of years and that I've been helping with this year, I can multiply up nectar and pollen species records from the literature to find out total nectar contributions for the different habitat types. But 5 species that are growing on the foreshore have no recorded nectar values, and 35 species have no recorded pollen values. So I'm going to be quantifying, or I have been quantifying, some of my own. And nectar quantification, so I'm using the same method as the Hicks et al. Paper, so it's comparable. It's done through getting your plant, you bag the floral unit for 24 hours. This allows all the nectar to accumulate and it stops any insects from coming and depleting it. You take your floral unit. If the nectar is runny enough, you can use a microcapillary, which is a little glass tube of a known volume which takes up the nectar through capillary action. Sometimes, due to weather conditions or all manner of things, the nectar is a bit gloopier and it's hard to take up, so you can dilute it with a known volume of pure water. And when you've got the nectar samples through either of those means, you can use a refractometer, and this will tell you the percentage sugar by volume, which then you can work out the actual sugar per floral unit. And then pollen quantification is done through multiplying your number of anthers per flower with the number of pollen grains per anther with the volume of a pollen grain. So you take your flower before it's opened, you let it open in the lab, and you wait for the anthers to dehisce. You take your pollen grains and count them using a hemocytometer, and then you measure your pollen grain volume using a microscope and an eyepiece graticule. So I don't have any sort of set in stone results, but what I do have are some preliminary results that I'm going to share with you guys just to give an overview of what's going on the foreshore. So this looks quite confusing, but I will take you through. So this is the floral composition of the meadow sites, so the planted sites from this year. You can see this is the month as we go across, and here is the contribution of floral units, or the proportion of floral units per plant species. So, for example, at this point here in April, you can see that almost 75% of plants growing in the meadows are actually Taraxacum plants. And then as you go further into the year, in June and July, it switches over to the yellow, which is Lotus caniculatus, and then the purple, which is Rhinanthus minor. And I've put floral abundance next to it, so you can see that actually, even though these look like the majority of the meadows is made up with Bellis perennis and Taraxacum, actually floral abundance is really low at this point. So they are in there and they're making up all of the flowering plants, but there actually might not be that many present. However, when you get to this peak in June of floral unit abundance, you know that these guys, so the lotus and the rhinanthus, there's actually lots of them going on. And then there's a bit of a dip again, and this is the Vitia cracker, and the Achillea millefolium is coming in there as well. So I use the same colours for all the plants. So as you can see, as I move between the graphs, there's actually quite a difference in species composition, just in terms of what's in there between the plots. In this one, this is the non-mode sites, so these are just left all year. The majority of plants in the early or the late spring are Taraxacum, and then it moves on to, the colours are a bit hard to see actually on this, but this is Veronica Comedris, and then Celeria graminea is making up the majority of floral units. For this one, actually, they really start kicking off in terms of floral abundance earlier in the year. So April and then especially May. These ones here, so Taraxacum, you've actually got a lot of Taraxacums there, and Veronicas, you've got a lot of Veronicas. So it's slightly different to the planted meadows that take a bit longer to kick off. And these are for the mode sites, so these are like the immunity grassland type sites. So again, the Taraxacum is making up a large percentage of plant species in May, which is when these sites actually have their highest floral abundance. And also Bellis perennis and Trifolium repens are the main contributors to these sites. So a lot of these like weed species that we'd associate with being weed species. So I started doing a little bit of work on nectar contributions from each habitat type. So taking the floral unit surveys and also the nectar values I then sort of worked out the percentage nectar contribution of each habitat type over the year. So again, this is starting in February, ending in August, and this is how much of the overall nectar of all the plots is contributed by each habitat type. And this is what that total nectar production is. So in March, in April, looks like the planted meadows are contributing a lot of nectar, and they are contributing the most nectar out of all the types, but actually there's a very low amount of nectar being produced on the whole. What's interesting is that in May, when nectar production is actually quite high and is really kicking off, the majority of the nectar is being contributed to by the non-mowed and the mowed habitats. And the planted meadows aren't actually contributing that much at all. And then as the summer goes on, the planted meadows really come into their own and provide lots of lovely nectar. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and probably because of those weed species that I keep bringing up, like the Taraxacum, that are really, really good nectar producers. And yeah, that flower earlier in the year. So I've got a lot of questions still to ask, and that I'm going to be asking and hopefully finding out over the next few months using this data. Firstly, I want to know whether insect visitation correlates with these early nectar contributions of the mowed meadows. So is there actually a link between this early spike of nectar contribution and insect pollinator visitation? How does each habitat vary in terms of pollen? So I've looked at nectar, but I haven't got onto the pollen side yet. And how does it change over the season? What pollinators visit which plants? So I still want to make this plant pollinator network of the foreshore, because I think it'd be really interesting to see who's visiting what. And then in what ways do differences in floral resource provision between habitats contribute to insect diversity and abundance? So what the managers want to know, basically, so what is the importance of each of these management types for insects? And then, oh God, it's all over the place. Lastly, I wanted to fit some statistical models to see how floral abundance provisions of each habitat type predict insect pollinator abundance and diversity, but over all 3 years of data. So using the past 3 years of data that have been collected on both floral and insect diversity. So yeah, thank you.